Welcome. I'm Carla Hayden, the 14th Librarian of Congress. And last year, I announced the selection of Danielle Allen as the winner of the Kluge Prize, the most prestigious honor given in the humanities. Dr. Allen is the James Bryant Conant Professor of Government at Harvard University. She is internationally known as a leading scholar of the origins of democracy and is active in efforts to support civics education and democratic practice. Last year, she brought together a multidisciplinary group of academic and public leaders that developed the highly influential Roadmap to Pandemic Resilience. This year, as the Kluge Prize laureate, Dr. Allen is leading a series of public events as well as workshops for K-12 educators here at the library. This series is titled Our Common Purpose, a campaign for civic strength at the Library of Congress. Today, we are holding the second of these events with a distinguished panel drawn from around the country, a discussion of electoral institutions and how they may be reformed. Thank you for tuning in to this important conversation. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. John Haskell, Director of the Kluge Center at the library, to introduce the panelists. John?
Thank you, Dr. Hayden, and thank all of you for joining us for the second event in Our Common Purpose, a campaign for civic strength at the Library of Congress. Here we are in the third decade of the 21st century, and Americans' faith in the functioning of our major political institutions is at a low ebb. It is not an overstatement to say our institutions have faced unprecedented challenges. Kluge Prize winner Danielle Allen worked with us at the library to put together a panel that includes people working on the ground at the state and local level to initiate major institutional reforms. Joining us today are Katie Fahey, Executive Director of The People, an organization committed to empowering individuals to get involved in the political process and create a more responsive government at all levels. Katie is a leader in the democratic reform movement, including a successful effort in Michigan to pass a ballot proposal that made political gerrymandering illegal. Kara McCormick co-founded and co-leads the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting, the historic campaign that made Maine the first state in the nation to adopt ranked choice voting for its state and federal elections. She is the CEO of the Chamberlain Project and the volunteer executive director of the Chamberlain Project Foundation, entities that support ranked choice voting in Maine and around the country. And last, we have Lee Drutman, a senior fellow in the Political Reform Program at New America and the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, the Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America. He is co-host of the podcast Politics in Question, and he writes for the New York Times, 538, among other outlets. Before I turn the program over to Danielle Allen, I want to recognize the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which has supported this effort every step of the way.
The American Academy of Arts and Sciences launched a project to examine and then address what people feel and experience in America's ongoing experiment in self-governance. What's working? What isn't? What can be done? The project's final report is Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. Kluge Prize winner Danielle Allen developed the recommendations with co-chairs Eric Liu and Stephen Hines, and 30 other commission members. They consulted experts across the political spectrum and talked to Americans from every walk of life.
What we're trying to do is inspire commitment to American democracy and to one another.
I think we are at a crisis point in our democracy where a lot of people feel they aren't being heard. A lot of people feel disconnected from our political institutions.
So I always quote my mom with this, I always say, Mom, why don't you vote? And she would say, ¿por qué? Basically, why? Nothing's going to change. We'll still be poor. I'll still have to work 3 jobs. And you look at it again, and when you think about that generational sense, that people have just been so disengaged that politics will not change their status.
Democracies are kind of built on this idea that people's voices are heard and that everyone has one vote and, we're all equals. But unfortunately, I feel like it isn't that way.
I think government is a big machine. I think government represents the interests of those who speak up the loudest.
I think a lot of people are more and more aware of the money in politics, that if money has an outsized influence in what our legislators do, then the people themselves are not having as much of an impact.
People don't trust the data. They feel like there are certain people who hold the power and that they are the ones making the decisions.
Sometimes you think about it, is it intentional? Is it a way for us to be able to look at government and say, you know what, they're not going to do anything for me, so I'm not going to vote?
So I think it gets back to the frustration that people feel about engaging government.
Our citizens are not engaged with us. They're not engaged in finding and working together to build solutions to community problems because they don't see the problem as theirs. We have to do everything in our authority as leaders in our beautiful republic to reframe those conversations, to re-engage our citizens, and therefore reinvigorate our republic.
Democracy demands that we all participate.
One of the big values that we need is commitment, and that shared civic commitment to say, this is important enough to give our time and our energy to, because without that commitment, it's simply not going to fly.
If we can stay engaged, we can help government evolve, then maybe we can have a more modern and truly representative democracy going forward.
Progress takes time. We have to be patient. This is hard work, and someone has to do it, making sure that our experiment in democracy is a success.
Hello, we are so thrilled that you are here with us at the Library of Congress for a conversation about how political institutions shape outcomes and how we might reform them. This conversation grows out of work that I had the privilege to do over several years for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We ran a commission and released a report in June 2020 called Our Common Purpose: Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. Before we released this report, we spent a lot of time talking with Americans all over the country about their frustrations with our democracy. Lots of people have frustrations right now. Lots of times we'll say to ourselves, gosh, we should all participate more. But the truth is, it's hard to believe in participating more if you don't think that the institutions are responsive, if they feel as if they leave you disempowered, or if you think you don't have equal voice or representation in the institutions. So the truth is that having a healthy constitutional democracy requires both institutions that deliver what we ask of them and a culture of participation. We need both of those things operating together. Today, we're really going to focus on that conversation about political institutions with a set of people who have made a tremendous difference for the health of our constitutional democracy. It's a real pleasure for me to have the chance today to talk with these three extraordinary reformers. We're going to start by learning about their experiences, their stories and work, and then dig into the question of what's wrong with our democracy, what's our diagnosis, and what do we think the pathway forward is. But the very first thing I want to do is actually just ask each of them to share what they hear when they hear the words political institutions. What does that phrase mean to them? Kara, can I start with you?
Sure, Danielle, and thanks so much for having me, and it's great to see you, Lee and Katie, and thank you to the Library of Congress. So what I hear when I hear political institutions specifically is I kind of hear that's the way that we vote to me. So it's first past the post plurality voting is what I hear when I think about that word institution in the context of at least my work in the democratic reform movement.
Great. Thank you, Kara. And how about you, Lee? What does the phrase political institutions mean to you?
So to me, it means the broader structures by which we do politics. So elections are an incredibly important part of that. And it's something like Kara that I think a lot about. But I also think about governing institutions like Congress or the presidency, as sort of formal institutions, and then we could think even more broadly about informal institutions like norms or traditions. But broadly, I think you think of institutions as just kind of the both written and unwritten rules of how we do politics.
Great. Thank you, Lee. And how about you, Katie? In your work, what does that phrase mean?
Yeah, I think very similar to what both Kara and Lee said. I think political institutions are really the organizations, the people, the bodies that make the rules and implement the rules of how government happens. I'd also include nonprofits who traditionally bring about policy change or help write laws. I think the overall political landscape, when you think about what does government have to do, how does it pass laws, how does it regulate things, I think all of that is part of a wider institution, including the political parties too, all part of that.
That's great. Thank you so much. So each of you has really been working on moving a boulder. Katie, you've made incredible changes around independent redistricting. Kara, you've moved ranked choice voting forward. We'll talk a lot more about what that is exactly. Lee, you've really challenged us all to rethink our two-party duopoly, as you call it. And before we dig into the specific bodies of work you've each been doing, I'd love if you could just share a story about how you got started. What was that aha moment, that wake-up moment that made you believe you had to devote your time and energy to working on the health of our democracy? Katie, can I ask you to go first?
Sure. And I'm actually here kind of by accident. My background is in sustainable business. I worked in grocery stores, and I made a Facebook post one day that led to me leading a charge to amend our Constitution to have an independent citizens commission instead of gerrymandering. So, but how I got there, I was recently out of college, and our government I just saw was failing us. I had always participated in voting, kind of paid attention, didn't really love the party aspect of things. And there was a law passed in Michigan called the Emergency Manager Law, which is a really unpopular law that the people of Michigan actually voted to get rid of. And then our legislature, which had just gotten elected in the most recent redistricting cycle, decided that the first thing they were going to do as a new legislature was find a loophole to reinstate that law, even though millions of people had actually voted to get rid of it. What's lesser known is that that law actually is one of the root causes of the Flint water crisis that happened in Michigan, which from a decision to switch where the source of water was coming from ended up poisoning an entire city. Government officials ended up covering up the actual data and information so that people couldn't respond to that in a timely fashion. And afterwards, as just a citizen of Michigan, it looked like everybody was just pointing fingers at each other, saying, oh, it's your fault, it's your fault. Meanwhile, you have kids still at schools that can't drink water. And I just kept thinking about how is this the America I thought I lived in? How are there people who are going to school right now who don't have water and nobody even really cares? And nobody is really taking seriously, how do we prevent this in the future? That's kind of what, for me personally, when I kind of thought of how do we actually get accountability back into our politics? How does it make it so that when clearly there are millions of people, the majority of people want a change to happen, our government will actually respond to that change and truly be for, by, and of the people, have the power be vested in us. And that's really when I decided, I can't keep just going to work hoping somebody else is going to fix it, because I really, really wasn't looking around and seeing people who seemed serious about doing that. And that's when I made that Facebook post.
That's great. So just remind us again, the year you made that Facebook post was what year? What year?
Yeah, it was 2016, right after the presidential election. The other thing I had been seeing is that a lot of friends and family for the first time ever were actually motivated to vote, mostly because of Bernie Sanders and President Trump. They were seeing a candidate talking about reforming the system, tearing it down, draining the swamp, all of that. And I thought, maybe something that unites us is wanting to fix the system. And so I threw that out into the universe.
So that's a really powerful story you tell, the Flint water crisis, and you're drawing a real bright line between how our democracy works and important things that matter in people's lives on a daily basis. So the relationship between our political institutions and what people would call substantive policy. We can talk about water, we can care about water, but we can't actually address it if we're not also thinking about the health of our democracy. That's a really critical point. Now, I'm asking you to tell these questions about personal stories because one of the things I'm really interested in is how the perception that our democracy is broken has crystallized for people and started to bring together the pieces of a movement, a democracy reform movement, you could call it. We've had other periods in our country's history where there's also been a sense of a need to really look at the root of how our democracy operates and then make change. And people sort of lose sight of the fact that that can be a long arc of time it takes. So you think of the years from 1776 to 1787, 88, 89. There was the revolution. They wrote the Articles of Confederation. They tried to work with it. It wasn't working. Lots of sense of frustration bubbled up, but it took that whole decade-long arc for people really to have a clear understanding of a new direction they needed to pursue. Kara, I think if I am right in understanding the arc of your own work, your aha moment is earlier than Katie's. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Yeah, it's a little bit earlier. I've worked in political reform now for about 11 years. I was inspired to form the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting with Dick Woodbury after working with Peter Ackerman and the team at Americans Elect, and also for two independent political candidates, Angus King, who ran in 2012, and then Elliot Cutler, who ran in 2014 in Maine. And Senator Woodbury and I met in a coffee shop on Milk Street in Portland, Maine, downtown. It was after I had had a light bulb moment in the summer of 2014. And at that point, I really kind of got it in my bones that number one, first past the post voting was just so unhealthy for our democracy. And then number two, it occurred to me that ranked choice voting could actually fix this situation forever. And number three, that our ancestors 100 years beforehand had given us very specific directions about how to fix the structure by ourselves without the aid of politicians by using the initiative process. And when all three of those things sort of came together for me at that point, there was pretty much no stopping.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. I want to hear more of the story, but first I want to ask you, if you don't mind, if you could just go ahead and explain again to everybody what first past the post voting is. What does that even mean? What's ranked choice voting? And then we'll come back to your aha moment.
Sure. So first past the post voting is the system that most of us use now, where you go into the ballot box and you can choose one person. You can vote for one person, and you can't vote for anybody else. So you choose one, and that's the extent of your decision making and weighing of your preference. With ranked choice voting, you go into the ballot box and you can rank your preferences of the candidates in order of truly what you think. You can choose your first choice, your second choice, and so on. And when the ballots are counted, the candidate that wins 50% of the vote in aggregate is the winner.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. So you were, I think, about to tell us that Maine's Constitution, 100 years ago, roughly speaking, you can give us the exact dates, introduced this power for the people to make changes in the basic rules of the game. And that's what you discovered and realized you could take matters into your own hands, if I got that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I realized I was working on I had worked on a series of three-way races in Maine, where there was a very successful Democrat, a successful Republican, and a successful independent. So three really good candidates in a race. 9 out of the last 11 governors in Maine had been elected with the majority of the vote, because we have a lot of independents that run. And the entire conversation in 2014 anyway was about who was going to spoil the race for whom, and that a vote for this person was actually a vote for that person, and a vote for this was a wasted vote. And you couldn't really make heads or tails of how it was going to work. And we knew that we were going to get a candidate elected without a majority of the vote. And when I realized that it was the first past the post voting system that was causing this problem, and not any of these individual candidates, and that ranked choice voting was the solution to it, and also that our Constitution would allow us to change it, that was pretty cool combination of conclusions.
Can you just tell us more about the Maine Constitution and exactly what it says that gave you an opportunity?
So the first thing that it says is that the citizens are sort of as powerful as the legislature. that together, if we were to collect, I think it was the first time, 61,123 signatures from registered voters across the state in favor of putting our initiative for ranked choice voting on the ballot, that we would be able to get our initiative on the ballot. And, we had to turn it in by midnight on the third Tuesday before the Saturday. It was very, very specifically prescribed, the steps that you had to go through in order to do this. And so I thought, well, if we just follow this exactly, and then we get on the ballot and then we run a campaign and win, then we'll have ranked choice voting. The story goes on much longer than that. And we can talk about that later if you want. But what happened in Maine is we passed the law for RCV in November of 2016. And 10 months later, our state legislature repealed it in a special session in the middle of the night. And at that point, I turned back to the Maine Constitution and saw that our ancestors had also given us something called the People's Veto, which allowed us to do the same thing again, this time in 88 days, and we could reverse what the legislature did and get our law back.
Wow. Okay, we're going to dig more into that story for sure. I want to just go back to one other element of your personal narrative. I think that you also worked in DC, I believe, in the 90s. Is that right? Or you were tracking changes in Congress and also thought that you saw our democracy really changing at that point in time. Can you remind me what that moment was for you?
Sure. I started working in politics right out of college. My first job was with Jerry Brown when he was running for president. And I started working in U.S. Senate politics and congressional politics as a researcher in 1992 was my first cycle, and worked every 2 cycles after that. And I saw a situation where I always worked for Democrats until 2012, but I saw a situation where these elections were just getting sort of more and more divisive. You would have, I remember sitting in a campaign office in 1996 and working for a Democrat and being happy when things that I cared about would fail in the Senate, on the Senate floor, because then we could use the information, the votes against the Republicans. And, that was that. How do you expect for people after they run so hard against each other in a campaign to then go and govern together?
Right. So that's really helpful. So that was another moment, a sort of aha moment for you, that there was sort of a mismatch between our hopes for our political institutions and what we were actually in the process of doing in the sort of day-to-day sausage making, it sounds like. Lee, I want to come around to you. I mean, I think you've made the question of the health of democracy really also your life's work. And I think that for you goes back to college. Can you say something on your side about what it was that brought your attention to this subject, that made you feel a sense of urgency about responding to the health of our democracy?
Yeah, well, I'm in my younger days, I found myself just being kind of anti-consumerist and feeling like there was just something wrong with the American lifestyle and how consumerist oriented we were, which got me to start thinking about the structure of our economy and the power of corporations, which then got me to thinking about corporate lobbying about the time when I was in graduate school. And then I wound up doing a PhD dissertation on corporate lobbying, which I then turned into a book, The Business of America is Lobbying. And in trying to understand why corporate lobbyists seem to have so much influence in our politics, I came across what was actually a surprisingly straightforward answer, which is that Congress itself had basically hollowed out its own institutional policymaking capacity, and Congress wasn't really investing in policymaking expertise. Instead, it was outsourcing that increasingly to corporate lobbyists. And so I tried to understand, well, why was that the case? And I came to appreciate that it had a lot to do with the centralization of leadership in Congress, which was both a function and an amplifier of polarization of the type that Kara talks about in her experiences, and it really starts in the mid '90s. And I came to appreciate that, although I continue to support adding more staff and expertise to Congress, that there was a deeper problem, which was actually also what Kara describes, is that the members of Congress and their staff didn't really want to solve the problems. They wanted to have issues to run on. And it was all focused on winning these narrow majorities. And then, of course, there was the 2016 election, which was a wake-up call for a lot of people. But one of the things that I realized in the 2016 election, I wrote a long essay about it for Vox, was that American politics had become this zero-sum conflict over two very different visions of what is our national identity, and a politics organized around this zero-sum fight over who we are was a politics that was only going to deteriorate and decline further. And that I realized that we were stuck in what I call the two-party doom loop, which is that we've set ourselves up for this binary conflict that is not really resolvable as a binary conflict.
Thank you for sharing that. So the reason I've been sort of pushing on all of you to tell your stories and to sort of think about where you got your start is because I'm trying to understand what the shape is of this effort to reform our democratic institutions for the country as a whole. So if we're sort of thinking in the big arc of history, are we watching, a little effort here and a little effort there and sort of lots of piecemeal bits, or are we watching the coalescence of a real moment of transformation? And I think if we look at our history, we've seen other moments of transformation, right? So we saw the way in which the suffragettes' endeavor took a real extended stretch of time to achieve, in the end, the 19th Amendment and voting rights for women, and sort of work done in different states in a piecemeal way eventually sums up to this really transformative moment. And in some sense, we also saw the same thing with marriage equality, where over the course of a decade, you see lots of different kinds of efforts, experiments, conflicts at the state level. Eventually, a paradigm starts to emerge, and then the Supreme Court confirms a sort of transformation of the basic rules of the game. So this is what I'm trying to figure out. In the democracy reform space, are we starting to see a movement coalesce across states and these pieces coming together? It would be great if you could share a bit more about how you've achieved success and what you see about that broader national landscape. So Kara, maybe I'll come back to you at this point. And also if you could pick up the issue of, you were able to use ballot propositions in Maine, but not every state has a ballot proposition option. So how do we think about that piece of the puzzle?
Sure. So in Maine, we have a very robust citizen initiative process. I explained it a little bit more. It's spelled out in our Constitution. It required us to gather 61,123 signatures to put question 5 on the ballot. When we won, we wrongly assumed that the battle was over. We did not anticipate that the legislature would repeal our law in the middle of the night. And luckily for us, it was spelled out in the Constitution, something called the People's Veto, so that if we gathered another 61,123 signatures in 88 days, we could get our law back from the legislature who had stolen it away and vote a second time for ranked choice voting. I will never forget when I discovered that People's Veto in the Constitution in Maine. I kept reading it over and over again to make sure that it was real, because what it meant to me was that our ancestors had predicted 100 years before that the legislature could try to reverse what the citizens had done, and that they had given us this way to fight back. And so even though we didn't have a single dollar at that point, I knew we had to keep fighting because, we couldn't squander this opportunity that they had given us, that they had anticipated what our struggle would be, and that they'd given us this. And, just about other states not having citizen initiative process, it's astonishing to me that Americans living in states without citizen democracy will stand for having fewer democratic, little d democratic rights than we have here in Maine. And I think that citizens are only kind of limited by their own imaginations when it comes to remedying this for themselves. You know, people power is a real thing in this country. Katie knows this. You know, our government really does belong to us here, and we have a responsibility to our kids and our grandkids to move things forward, and to sort of honor all of the different ways that our ancestors kind of set these structures up to support us in making sure that we can get the balance right.
So even though you're working in Maine and Katie's working in Michigan, you think you're working on the same thing, or do you think you're working on separate things?
I mean, Katie can talk, but she and I didn't know each other while this was going on, but I kept hearing about this woman named Katie in Michigan who was doing the same work that I was doing in Maine in 2018. So for the second campaign that we had to win. And it's amazing when she and I finally did get a chance to meet and kind of went over all of our war stories after, you know, and hours of conversation, how much similarity there was in these battles. And also that it's for sure a battle. And it's not some sort of happy kumbaya thing. There are determined adversaries who are trying to stop you when you're trying to change, particularly the system that they're used to operating in and getting elected in. And legislatures don't love citizen democracy at all. They like to keep that for themselves. And so there's this real tension, but in the tension is the beauty. That's where we can hopefully come out on the other side of it together. And so, yeah, when Katie and I finally got a chance to talk, we could finish each other's sentences, and it's extraordinary how similar the battles were, how similar the obstacles were, and how similar, in particular, the fact that we were both like religious about making sure that our campaigns included Democrats, Republicans, and independents working together to fix the broken system without fear or favor for any one particular candidate or political party or ideology, that we were all doing this thing that was sort of underneath it all and much more fundamental, and brought us together.
That's great. Thank you, Kara. Katie, tell us your story. I mean, you just did amazing things in Michigan. Can you just tell everybody the whole story of what you did and how?
Yeah. And I just feeding off of what Kara was saying too. I mean, I do think that this is truly a movement. When we were doing our ballot initiative in Michigan, there was actually 3 others going on at the same time in Missouri and in Utah, as well as Colorado, and then Michigan. And, very different things happening on the ground in those states. But I think one of the turning points has been, and why you also saw movements on ranked choice voting and lobbying reform and many of these kind of institutional rule changes, I think is because it's very clear that we're facing very real world 21st century problems that aren't being addressed. And you grow up and you're hearing about how much debt is getting piled on and global warming and also just jobs and not being able to own a house. And at least as a millennial, it's like I grew up with a very clear understanding that we were in real trouble as a country. And then to not see the urgency of our institutions actually addressing those things or even trying to compromise on those things to actually pass anything was just kind of like a breaking point that I think people are feeling. But I think back to Michigan, I put out a Facebook post that said, hey, I want to take on gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to help, let me know. Smiley face. I think the emoji was very key to helping secure volunteers. Because I had actually made a Facebook post earlier, like a couple of years earlier. Nobody even liked it. But this one, for whatever reason, started getting shared. And suddenly overnight, actually over afternoon, because I posted in the morning, I was connected to hundreds of strangers, all messaging me saying, I've heard about this issue for such a long time. I didn't know we could do anything about it. How can I help? And then I had to Google, how do you end gerrymandering? I knew I didn't like gerrymandering. I knew there were probably ways to end it. I actually did not know how we were going to do that. Like Kara, I did know vaguely about the ballot initiative process, but really reading our Michigan Constitution, the first line, Article 1, Section 2 is all political power is inherent in the people. And then it goes down to explain that if citizens can write constitutional language, gather a bunch of signatures, then we can put this question for a vote of the general public, and they can decide whether our constitution will be amended or not. And when doing research on, well, has anybody tried to really address gerrymandering or redistricting before, we had seen that over 14 bills had been introduced over several decades in Michigan, never with bipartisan support, always seeming to be from the team that was being gerrymandered. And in Michigan, both Democrats and Republicans taken advantage of the line drawing process themselves. But also that those bills had never even been brought up to a vote. So our institution that is supposed to write laws and make sure that it is functioning properly is failing to actually address its own rule changes, which for a lot of reasons made sense for a lot of reasons, because why would they give themselves less power if they think they're going to be able to take advantage of the system to get reelected more easily? But that's when it really became clear that the way to try to change this was going to be through the ballot initiative process. So when writing constitutional language, we had a bunch of people who were doing a lot of research, calling other states, seeing what they had done. Thankfully, there were examples of other states who had other redistricting where they didn't have the legislators drawing the line. So Iowa and California and Arizona. And we had this moment, though, of realizing that part of the problem with gerrymandering is that these decisions that impact 10 years worth of elections at a time are all happening behind closed doors, with nobody really being able to understand the intent behind why these things were happening. And we realized that we were a group of internet strangers. We were all working very honestly. It was like Kara was saying, 100% like we were not going to have a solution that disadvantaged any Michigan voter based on who they wanted to vote for, what party they vote for. But we were still kind of, like, if we're going to amend the Constitution, let's try and be authentic about it. So we decided to hold town halls, something that at the time our politicians were refusing to do. And we did 33 town halls in 33 days. We have 14 congressional districts in Michigan. We went to each one at least twice, and then held some extras too with different languages and in different parts of the state that had been disproportionately impacted by gerrymandering for decades, to ask people, do we like the system? If we don't like the system, who should draw the lines? What should the rules around what representation looks like be? What should this process overall be? And that's actually, we kind of crowdsourced in a way our constitutional language. But the beautiful part of that for me is it felt like what I had learned democracy was supposed to be. It was people coming together, and even though they had vastly different ideas. I mean, some people were like, let's get the University of Michigan, Michigan State football coaches to have to draw the lines together. Like that was literally a proposal somebody brought up. And other people are like, well, let's have like 50 people draw the line. So, they were coming in very strong opinions, but everybody was there wanting a solution that was going to work best for everybody, and wanting buy-in and consideration from different parts of the state. So listening to the really rural parts of the state, the really urban parts of the state. And that's how we started forming basically a volunteer army of people who wanted to see this passed, regardless of political affiliation. So we gathered actually 428,000 signatures in 110 days from all 83 counties of our state, which we think is the first time the Citizen Ballot Initiative process has ever had signatures from all 83 counties.
Wow.
We then had to talk to people about what this was. We faced the Supreme Court challenge. We filled the courts with people, just showing that this really was about the people and about us using our Constitution. We were able to overcome that. And then ultimately we secured 2.5 million plus votes, 61% of the vote. And now in Michigan, one of the most exciting parts is for the first time ever, 9.9 million people are involved in this process that draws the districts of who our representatives are going to be for the first time ever. And our independent commission is up and running, which has been very exciting. And it's a citizens commission, meaning, we've found people who haven't been former legislators or aren't about to run for legislation. And they all submitted essays for why they wanted to be on it. And one of the most beautiful parts, if that's the right word to use for me, was every single one of them actually brought up some kind of trust. Like, I feel like the people in our state need to be able to trust that these decisions are being made the right way. That's why I want to serve. I want to do my civic duty and ensure that our lines are drawn fairly and not biased. Like every single person, whether Democrat, Republican, Independent. And that's what we were really hoping for. And I think is at the root of a lot of this is we just want our systems being designed and implemented for the purpose that they're saying they are for. And for redistricting, it's about representation, about having an actual representative government, having a person that will represent your community in your state legislature and in Washington, D.C.
So that's a really powerful story, Katie, and I'm really interested in the resonances between Kara's story and your story, that you're both telling an account of people from different party lines, all of whom have a shared sense of a sort of deep issue, the need to have representative institutions work the way they're supposed to work, actually be representative, be responsive to the people. It's a beautiful thing to discover that shared perspective across those ideological lines, and a beautiful thing to discover a shared interest in wanting our institutions to be trustworthy. I want to ask, though, it must have been kind of hard, at least at some points, to get people to be able to collaborate and communicate across those party lines. What were some of the challenges you had to deal with to actually achieve that shared coordination and effort?
Yeah, I mean, for us, one of my favorite stories is we had 3 sisters who were volunteers for us, and they said this is the first and only thing they've ever been able to all volunteer for. One was a Democrat, Republican, one's an independent. At parties, they're always arguing about this, but about like differences in opinions, but this is where it came to be. And I think it was, and Kara, I think you experienced this too. We just ran campaigns completely differently than they normally are run. I mean, normally you're like trying to attack somebody. It's always, even when we first were able to talk to somebody about fundraising, they were like, well, who's your enemy? And we're going to attack over and over and over again. And pushing back against that, I was brand new. I hadn't done this before. I felt really strongly if I was going to be dedicating my time, my energy, my passion towards something, I didn't want to perpetuate the status quo. I didn't want to have more negative TV ads that I'm going to watch. Like, so let's at least try. And so pushing back against the kind of institutions or even the advice that you get on running a campaign, that was actually fairly hard. I kept my ground and said, I think that even just letting people know what this is might be able to be resonant, and let's see what the polling says. Let's see how people respond. And thankfully that really worked, being able to just talk about what we were aspiring to and the problem with the status quo. Our name was Voters, Not Politicians. And what we meant by that was voters should draw the lines, not politicians. But a lot of people took it as anti-politician, which kind of worked in our favor. There was kind of that uniting around the establishment isn't really looking out for me, and I wanted to actually look out for me. So even from training, we started with a Facebook group, and on social media, everybody is so ready to identify each other and attack each other. And it took a culture shift in moderating people and letting them know, there are everywhere else on the internet, you can go and attack each other, assuming you know how each other voted, but this isn't going to be the place. This is the place we're going to be focused on action and focused on what do we have in common that can help them pass. And that actually, I think, challenged people to rise up to what a lot of us maybe want to do, but isn't the default setting. The default setting is maybe the easy, like, I'm just going to come up with a snarky meme or comment that kind of can attack you, but isn't giving you the benefit of the doubt or asking questions to understand more. And by slowly changing that culture, we saw a whole shift in people's attitudes towards not only each other, but even themselves, and why they felt like this work was so important. The number of stories of people saying, I went to a voter, I talked to a Democrat today and they actually said they believed in fairness and that's why they want to do this. Or I talked to a Republican today and he wants to donate, $100 and is all about redistricting. I didn't know that. I heard that over and over again. And I grew up in a family with different political opinions. So I think I just maybe took for granted knowing that like everybody who votes a certain way isn't evil or another way isn't evil, that we have a lot of other things that are in common or other motivations. But to be able to see that, that's when, and Kara, I don't know if you experienced this too, but I realized that, yes, we were fighting for redistricting and anti-gerrymandering, but actually we were like creating a new culture around what being in democracy looks like. And we were really fighting for like, what do we want democracy to look like in our country?
That is true leadership and people power, real democracy. I like your idea that it was about an authentic democratic experience as well, that you held those town halls all over Michigan. That's really extraordinary. Kara, I'm curious for you as well. Yes, I mean, what were the challenges for you in getting people to actually collaborate across those party lines?
I think that, well, the first time around, we had quite a lot of time to gather our signatures and run a proper campaign. And but the second time around, was really something, because they had taken something away from us. So at that point, you had a whole bunch of people who weren't even for ranked choice voting who joined our campaign, because they were so upset at the anti-democratic behavior of our legislature that the balance had gotten so off that they would feel that they could take something away, that people had voted for in a free and fair election in order what looked like to benefit themselves. But even then, we really tried very hard and never sort of went negative on any one particular politician. We were relentlessly positive, because we were trying to model the kind of politics that we think that ranked choice voting will encourage and bring about, which is that, we agree on so much more than we disagree on. It's just a fact that we agree on so much more in Maine and across the country. And yet we have this system that sort of forces us to sign up with one camp or the other, and to make everything right about our camp and everything wrong about the other camp. And it's just completely distorting what's actually so. The other thing is that it was a lovely experience. I've worked in Democratic politics my whole career, and what a lovely experience to be sitting on the floor with a very conservative Republican sorting through petitions and trying to figure out who's going to take what to Saco and what to Bangor. And that, we had so much work to do. The work of it itself was so difficult and so granular and so complicated that we didn't have time to do anything other than that. And it was very unifying. It was just there was a lot of unity in both of our campaigns, but particularly in the second campaign, because at that point it was all of us against the world and against an impossible deadline. And it was also the middle of winter in Maine, when we were experiencing weather threats. One of them was called a bomb cyclone. And I thought, okay, again, on social media, how do you collect signatures in the middle of a bomb cyclone?
Right.
How do you say
you needed,
even though the weather is really bad today?
So that's a really powerful story of common purpose emerging from this project to actually secure the democracy you believed you deserved. So really a sense of personal connection and empowerment to wanting those institutions to do what they should do, make good on their promises, be trustworthy, be what we expect of them. So that's very powerful. I mean, again, sort of bringing to life the way in which democracy itself is a living issue, touches our lives. It's not 3 steps removed from the matter of having food on the table or clean water, and so forth. Lee, I want to bring you back in here and invite you to share some of your analysis about the party system. I mean, both of the things that Kara and Katie have been working on do have the effect of reducing incumbency advantages, bringing more competitiveness back into our politics. And in that regard, also reducing the degree to which we have a duopoly with our 2 parties, a sort of exclusive control of the political system with our 2 parties. But do you think, is that enough from your point of view? I mean, do you see those positive effects on our party system coming out of those reforms, again, ranked choice voting and independent redistricting? Or is there more to the story for how we should think about how our parties are operating and what we might be working on?
So first off, I just want to say how much I admire the efforts of Kara and Katie and doing the hard work of democracy. And I almost feel not worthy to be with them, because they're the ones who are really out there and talking to people. And sometimes I feel like here I am just, sitting in an office in Washington, D.C. and writing books and articles, and that's all I am. So in terms of, the party system, and, I think it's important to understand, Kara talks about, I think rightly so, that there's a lot more that we could potentially agree on, but the way that political elections force us into these binary camps makes it very difficult to find agreement. And there's something about the binary nature of our politics that really kind of turbocharges these innate circuits that we have in our brains that like tend to put us into friend versus foe, us versus them, and that is an aspect of human nature that is just inherent. But we can triumph over that, and the way to triumph over that is not to put things in a binary condition that flattens and simplifies conflict, but rather to almost expand and multi-dimensionalize conflict, and think about how to find different compromises that are not just meeting in the middle, but a kind of Rubik's cube, multi-dimensional space of thinking creatively. And our politics just prevents that from happening in its current structure. Our partisan conflict has really flattened out into one party that represents urban cosmopolitan America and has one vision for the country, and one party that represents rural traditionalist America and has a very different vision. And they're butting up against each other with no clear resolution. So I think that the key is to kind of change. Essentially, it's to find a new dimension. It's like rather than just one dimension, you look down on things, sort of like entering flatland and seeing that there's a different way to approach things. And to me, it's multi-party democracy that allows us to do that, because it fundamentally scrambles this binary and breaks the constituent pieces apart and allows them to recombine and recreate in different ways, and takes away this logic of just trying to beat the other side. In a two-party system, you can be the lesser of two evils and still win. So there's an incredible incentive to just demonize. It's the unifying force to bring your coalition together, because the other side is going to destroy America. But there's no phrase lesser of three evils. I actually did do some crack research for my book, and found that it was the original title of a martial arts film that did very, very poorly and was later renamed Fists of the Warrior. But that was the only use. So that's my Googling story. But and the reason for that is simple. It's because you have to distinguish yourself from in a broader field, and you do that not by saying that the other side is terrible, but rather having a positive vision and trying to represent an affirmative view of what you want to stand for. And that's the kind of politics that I want to be part of. The other problem with our two-party system, and particularly the single-member districts, is that it means that most voters don't get to experience actual competitive elections, because when you have districts that are drawn based on geography, you're going to have a lot of urban districts that are going to be lopsided for Democrats. You're going to have a lot of rural districts that are lopsided for Republicans. And, although I 100% support independent redistricting commissions, I think that working with the limits of single member districts is inherently a limit, that you can get some competition, but there are limits to that, and so I think ranked choice voting, it comes in a single winner format, which is what Maine has. It also comes in a multi-winner format, which is what Ireland has used successfully for a century now. It's what Northern Ireland decided to implement after the peace accords, and the advantage of that is a proportional system is fair, and with the ranked voting aspect of it, you're requiring politicians to look beyond their limited base of support and try to be people's second choice and people's third choices. So one of the things that democracy experts around the world will tell you, that when you have a pluralistic, diverse society, you want to look for political institutions that build connections, that build cross-cutting coalitions, that encourage people to think beyond their traditional base of support and try to broaden that. And, and ranked choice voting is a great way of doing that, because it says, I might not be your first choice, but I want to be your second choice. And it encourages that kind of compromise and coalition building, which is inherent to successful politics. And it's fundamentally what our political institutions were designed to do. I mean, I think a lot about James Madison. And one of the things that James Madison is wrestling with in Federalist Number 10 is this fundamental challenge of how do you build a democracy in which there is diversity, in which there are factions and people have different viewpoints. And Madison's first great cause was religious liberty. And he was very fond of a saying from Voltaire, which has been translated different ways, but I think basically translates into, if there's one religion, it's arbitrary. If there's two religions, people are going to try to kill each other over what happens after they kill each other. And if there's many religions, people can live in peace because nobody's afraid of somebody dominating over them. And Madison really applied that to politics in his thinking. And he said, look, the key is basically to have no faction that is ever going to be totally dominant, so that different factions have to build broad coalitions. And as a result, you get some kind of public interest that emerges from this rough and tumble of coalitions that are constantly recombining and reshaping. There's no permanent winners, no permanent losers. And that's fundamentally a vision of multi-party democracy. Now, the challenge is that the framers just didn't understand that political parties are just inherent to modern mass democracy. And so they were so worried about political parties that they didn't think about how to create functional parties. And also at the time, there was one voting system, the 1430 innovation of first past the post, which was just kind of became the default voting system. Now we've had tremendous innovation in many other areas, and I think I can tell a very mostly progress-oriented story of American democracy. That each era, there's kind of a moment in which we expand the idea of American democracy and make it more participatory and more inclusive. And to your question of whether we're in another moment of that, I think we absolutely are. And you see tremendous similarities with the late Gilded Age in terms of inequality and frustration, into the transition of a new progressive era in which there are lots of social movements bubbling up from lots of different places, but all of them sharing a core sense that our democracy is not working and we can do better, because that's what we've always done.
So thank you so much for that set of reflections, Lee. And as we run to the end of this conversation now, I'm just going to acknowledge that for lots of people, I think probably watching this and listening to this, what's in their mind will be the controversies over voter suppression questions that are now unfolding, roiling many state legislatures. So I'm going to ask just for some closing thoughts, really next step thoughts, really from Kara and Katie, about where you think the democracy reform movement and effort goes next. But as you share those thoughts about what you hope will come next, it would be great if you could also just, perhaps give us some context for thinking about how the work that you've been doing on securing participation of people in democracy, on moving forward reforms that make our institutions more accountable and responsive, how does that relate to this broader conversation about voting rights that we're also having now? I know that's a big question, but Kara and Katie would welcome your closing thoughts on where we're all headed.
Well, so I think, of course, we can absolutely reinvent American democracy, because we're Americans, because it's in our DNA, because I watched it happen in Maine with my very own eyes, because there's absolutely nothing special about me. I just saw an opportunity. I saw a winning strategy to make the system better, and I went for it, and then thousands of people followed. And, ideas are very, very powerful. They are accepted in stages. And, what I'm hoping for is a country where everyone in Congress is elected with ranked choice voting, where there are no more spoilers, where no one can get elected without 50% of the vote, where everyone, including independent candidates, can compete on a level playing field, where candidates from the two major political parties are forced to compete with unaffiliated candidates, and that all of that's going to make our country stronger. I believe that we're entitled to, and that we are capable of having a political system in this country where the best idea is the one that wins, no matter where it comes from. I want a system where there's competition. I want a system where we can solve our problems again, because our leaders are incentivized to work with one another, to compromise with one another. But I really think that what you have to change is this underlying structure in order to make it happen. And if you change the underlying structure, that the benefits will be that will naturally occur, that we will become a better version of what is already, the greatest political system in the world. And I have huge, huge hopes for this, because I watched it happen with almost no resources. I watched people come out of their houses and get involved in the doing of the democracy. And when I watched that happen, I realized it was definitely not just in me, this drive to make things better. It was in all these people who surrounded me. It was my friends, it was my neighbors, it was people that I didn't know, it was people from every political party. Doing the democracy makes the democracy better. So I have huge, huge hope that we will break out of the two-party doom loop that Lee has described. And Lee, you have made a tremendously enormous contribution to the political reform movement with your scholarship and your work and your, all of the different presentations that you've made for people to see. And you've caused tons of people around the country to have aha moments, as have you, Danielle, not just writing it in the book that came from the Academy of Arts and Sciences. When you're a person on the ground doing this work, and you get this thing that says it's from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it actually says that ranked choice voting and independent redistricting is what we need to do to fix it, and it's from this, you can't believe how great it feels. Like when I will never forget when Catherine Gale and Michael Porter wrote this thing in a journal in Harvard talking about ranked choice voting. I thought, oh my God, Harvard! This is fantastic. It's not just some fringy thing anymore. It's becoming mainstream. It's becoming accepted, and it matters. All of us working together in each of the different ways where we all have skills towards something much better for our kids and for our grandkids.
Great, thank you. And Katie, what are your hopes for where this is all headed?
Yeah, I think the realization that lots of people have had is that voters should be deciding our elections and not politicians. And that means many different things. It means ranked choice voting. It means districts that actually are competitive or that are actually representative of a space. It also means, though, that how our elections are administered are actually nonpartisan, and you don't have people running for office in control of the election and the rules that follow it. I think if not in the 2020 presidential election, I do not know when we will have an aha moment of wow, there's a conflict of interest here that really puts our democracy at risk. And it doesn't matter which party is in charge. It doesn't matter in 20 years what the parties will look like and if they're in charge. There is just a conflict of interest for running for something and being able to dictate the rules that you are running in. And that's where I think, especially with these voter suppression laws, we need to address them, make sure they don't get passed, but we have to take away that power to be dictating these things. And there are solutions. I think that's also where Lee, but many other people come into mind. One of the aha moments I had was seeing my inbox flooded and realizing for the first time that I wasn't actually alone with feeling so frustrated and man, somebody should really do something about this. The aha moment I had, though, was I'm somebody. I can actually try to do this. And that's what a bunch of other people saw too. It was kind of I know the problems, I know what's at stake, but what can I actually do about it? That's the part of the narrative that I really hope we can continue to add to is like, what are the real ways we make these changes? What are the real solutions to, like ranked choice voting, like independent committees? Those are very important as well. But it's like, if we're all just waiting for the next election and hoping the right group of people get put into play, are they actually going to fix the system or not? And I think that's also up for debate right now. You know, how important is it to have a functioning democracy, and who's going to put their own reelection at stake to make sure that power is given up? Or is it going to have to come from us, the people of our country, ensuring that our government is actually going to be for, by, and of the people, which it never really has been. And we continue, as we were just talking about, to make those strides towards more. But I think that's what's at the top of my mind every day. We're about to go into the next redistricting cycle. Lines are going to be drawn that determine who will be your representative, and that is going to last for the next decade worth of elections. And I often think about the voters who can't even vote yet, but over the next 10 years, the first time they vote in an election, it's going to be one that their vote was targeted to try and make count less than their neighbors, all because of who they're voting for. And that's why we have to work so hard and diligently to stop. What's really amazing is that there's organizations like the People, and there's people like Kara and I who are working on this and who are finding other people to try and see what are the ways that we can actually work and address this. But it's going to take people in every single community showing up. One of the nice parts that I would just add is that a lot of politicians are counting on us not showing up. They're counting on business as usual, or, oh, I just push this through when nobody's paying attention in winter and nobody's going to want to go gather signatures. I mean, that's part of their own political calculus. And when you show up anyways, when you know about the laws, when you can go and advocate for yourself, for your communities, I think there really is an ability to change the power dynamics there, whether you have the ballot initiative process or whether you don't. And so I hope that that's what we continue to see, is more moving away from the conflicts of interest of politicians making these laws and dictating these processes that are so fundamental to the actual institution of our government.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, I mean, you're really telling us that the story of the shape of our political institutions is a story of us. It's not a story of somebody oughta. It's a story of we can, and it's on us to step up and bring the changes and transformations that, as you said, take conflict of interest out of the system, help our institutions succeed as accountable, responsive, and empowering tools of democracy that they should be. Kara, I think you said it, democracy fixes democracy. That is the big takeaway from this conversation. You've given us all a lot of reason for hope. I want to thank you for that, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership examples in the field. Kara and Katie, and on the page, Lee, you are reshaping our collective understanding of our democracy. Thank you very much.